Hello, friends. Welcome back to another edition of the Lovecast with Jamal podcast. I have a really special guest on the show today, someone I've been looking forward to having a conversation with. She's a lot of things, but a fantastic author, and has recently come out with a book called Returning to Eden, which I love the title. Fantastic title. Great cover.
Thank you.
Returning to Eden by Heather Hamilton. And we were just talking before we hit record here, just about the journey and some of the things that are discussed in this book. For me personally, have been very refreshing to hear them from a different angle, just because, this is, the word spiritual deconstruction gets thrown out there a lot, and it kind of gets put in a box, but it's not. This is not a monolithic conversation. There are a lot of different angles to this, and it's been nice to hear the angle which Heather is approaching this with, because it's just refreshing, and we'll talk more. You'll pick up on that as we go forward. But Heather, welcome to the show. So glad to have you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I've been really looking forward to talking to you.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, you've been involved in traditional Christian ministry for a number of years in the past. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I entered the ministry when I was like 7 years old, It's like just been one continuous uh life devotion, that started around that age. So,
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you've been on quite the journey. I mean, obviously, your beliefs have shifted quite a bit, your understanding of faith, and even I would imagine, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but your perception of God has completely been altered
yeah.
from your roots, right? Growing up in the Bible Belt, growing up in evangelical Christianity. In many ways, it may seem that your faith is unrecognizable today than it was at the beginning of your journey. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay,
I would go as far, just from this perspective now, I would almost say I had beliefs before. And once those completely shattered, then I entered into what was an authentic faith journey.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, because the word faith and belief are, in my understanding, unfortunately considered to be the same word. They're synonymous with each other, but they're not. It's very different. I would say belief is of the mind, and faith is a dimension of perception that comes from experience, and it's a whole different ball game. So I would imagine, as a child, though, you probably didn't perceive yourself being where you are now, or
no.
could not have perceived that. So I always when guests come on the show, I always kind of like to ask, like, what was it like for you? Just for the listeners that maybe don't know a little bit of your background. And I love how you talk about your background in your book, by the way. It's very helpful. But for the listeners who maybe are listening to this and haven't read the book, can you give us a little snapshot of what was it like to be you growing up as an evangelical Christian? That was very important to you. It wasn't something you just did on the side. This was a major part of your life. What was it like for you growing up in your house?
Yeah. To be honest, I feel like, a lot of people's stories are something along the lines of like, I was raised in a religious household and my family kind of drug me to church. Like I didn't have much of a say in the matter. And that was not the case for me. I feel like from a very young age, there was a driving force in me to be involved with the church, to learn about Jesus, to learn about the Bible. So my first introduction to it was in what's called Awanas, which, if your listeners aren't familiar with that, is really popular in the South, but it's like a children's program. You go weekly, like you get like a little, what looks like a Girl Scout or Boy Scout vest, and you memorize Bible verses, and, you get little pins and awards and everything for memorizing Bible verses. And I was really good at it. So it was like, I just kind of loved everything about it, and we moved around a little bit. And so each time we would move, it was really me who was like, I need to go find my youth group. We got to find my people kind of thing. So I didn't feel like religion was forced on me in any way from like my family. And so my belief was a very sincere, wholehearted, if I say I believe this, then I have to do it 100%. I didn't feel like it didn't make sense to me to subscribe to some belief and then not align my life with it. So that's probably a personality thing and has to do with, um, yeah, just different elements of my personality. But like the whole trajectory of my life was always filtered through what's God's will for my life, and even
Hmm.
in college, I studied journalism and was really into like film and video production. And I remember even having this conflict, like, eh, is this God's will for my life? Or do I need to be a missionary somewhere? Can I pursue what my dreams are, or do I have to drop it all and, go somewhere that I might not necessarily choose or want to go, but feel like this is God's will? So a lot of big decisions in my life, I would feel intense anxiety and angst over I'm going to make the wrong decision kind of thing.
Hmm.
So anyways, we were actually talking before the show, but at a really big conference one time, I
Hmm.
heard an evangelical pastor kind of um maybe put give the angle of, like what are the things that you're dreaming about? What are you doodling about in your journal? Um, if you want to go work at Goldman Sachs, then like good, you can get Jesus into that building kind of thing. So is essentially this permission to go, you know, you can go work in a secular industry because then you can bring Jesus there. So it was like, oh, boom, now the mission's aligned and I can do my film and video production, so we're good to go, and then it was like the next week I had landed an internship at Turner Broadcasting, so it was interesting with me trying to follow what my passions were, but
Hmm.
feeling I had to get the sign off from God in some way. So
Hmm.
until
Hmm.
I would have those kind of moments, it would be this intense
Hmm.
anxiety.
Amazing, amazing. I totally can relate. And I think what you're describing, is a deep desire from an early age for the ultimate, right? For
Mhm.
complete, total realization or
Mhm.
liberation. And it
Mhm.
comes out in this, we don't want to settle for um mechanics or just to go with emotions. We don't want to, we really want the ultimate. And
Mhm.
some people have that drive from the beginning. Not everybody does, and that's okay. It just always, you can always see a person who's marked for liberation in
Mhm.
this life, um from those are the marks. And so
Mhm.
I love that you've had that, and also the desire to belong, right? The desire to feel like our life is significant or matters in some way, shape, or form. And I think the ultimate fear for someone who's destined to this liberation is that you would live a life that just doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Um,
And yeah, I talked about that in my book, like a
mhm,
fear of being boring, which I think maybe could also just insignificant, or
mhm,
unseen. So I think retrospectively looking back, along with that drive, like that yearning for union with the divine, was also this attachment wounding where I'm trying to connect myself to something larger than myself.
mhm,
That vehicle ended up being, the evangelical church, and we were involved
sure.
with a really large and influential one. And that felt good, like from an egoic perspective,
Mhm,
I was telling myself, this is God's plan and we're a part of God's plan. And that's why this is like so successful and fun. And, everything we do, thousands of people come, it's like all that felt good to be a part of, but it was also meeting this
mm,
wounding in me of
sure.
fear of insignificance.
Totally, absolutely. And you do a great job in your book talking about the false self and the true
Mhm.
self, or sometimes what we call the ego being. And I, realize like we want to attach the ego, and this may sound real weird. The ego, I think, it gets a bad rap. The rap that the ego gets is that, oh, it's all it thinks so highly of itself, and that the truth is actually no, it doesn't. It's
Mhm.
actually it actually thinks very lowly of itself because it has a perception in being small, and so therefore the desire is to attach to something larger than ourselves. So I always say, look, if you drop the ego, you realize there's nothing bigger than you. There's nothing
Mhm.
larger than you.
Mhm.
But that's a whole other, I know, kind of perspective.
Yeah.
Um, but I remember having this conversation. I had a conversation with a friend. This is early in my own, spiritual deconstruction, if you want to use that word. And I remember just sitting on the. It was like it was a roommate I had, and he came from uh, a similar movement that
Mhm.
we had talked about off the air, and um, I knew his pastor and knew where he came from. This whole thing, and I just looked at him and I said, "Hey," it was like 11 o'clock at night. We are just watching TV. I said, "Do you think God's happy?" And he was like, what do you mean?" I said, "Do you think God's happy with you?"
Mhm.
He's like, "What do you, in what context?" I was like right now. He's like, "You mean like at 11 o'clock at night?" I'm like, "Well, yeah, like right now." He's like, "Well, we're just sitting on the couch or we're just watching TV." I was
Mhm.
like, "I know. Do you think he's happy?" He's like, I haven't really thought about it like that. But he goes, "No, probably not." And I was like, "Well, why not?" He's like, "Well, we're kind of wasting time right now. We're just watching TV. And
Mhm.
sure, there's some better use of my time. I could be reading my Bible or praying or something. Can't be happy." And I just thought that was so instrumental. Wow. And then I remember these words, "Well done, good and faithful servant." And I remember like his pastor would always say that I just live for the day that
Mhm.
Jesus would say to me, "Well done, good and faithful servant." And it clicked. I was like, you're living for that day in the future because that's not your present tense reality.
Mhm.
Wow.
Yeah.
What suffering.
I can really
And it
relate to
just
that. And it's a
clicked.
tricky thing. I actually had this discussion with John and Nat Turney on their
Mhm.
podcast. This interesting thing where in Protestantism, in on our brand evangelicalism, it was there was just such an emphasis on grace. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to earn it. It's not about the rules. It's this. You just believe the right thing, and then you're in. And so I had a lot of anxiety with that. Was I sincere enough? And so for years and years and years, it would be this, repeating the sinner's prayer, trying to settle my anxiety about the sincerity of my heart. So in theory, it was this very easy thing, you just
Mhm.
believe the formula and you're in. So easy. But I had a lot of obsessions about that and anxiety about it. And then once I finally got through that, then it became what you're talking about, the well done, good and faithful one. Like I wanted the stamp of approval. It's this interesting thing that you don't talk about or you can't really acknowledge is
Mhm.
actually going on, but it was a lot of hard work, like
Mhm.
exhausting trying to prove myself and make sure I was staying on track and that I wasn't
Mhm.
disappointing God in any way because it was, yeah, living for that. After you die, I want to get the pat on the head.
Mhm. Totally.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And when that's not our present tense reality, and
Hmm.
that's trauma.
Yeah.
And you know, something that you talk about in your book is that you had an ongoing experience with anxiety
Hmm.
growing up. It's part of, you probably couldn't even name it or even
Hmm.
understand that that's what it was, but at some point this came to a head for you. Can you talk a little bit more about your experience with anxiety, how it manifested in your body, in your life, and then when did it come to a head for you?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because there's a lot of talk about mental health now, and
Mhm.
I knew what anxiety and depression were or whatever, but as you're saying, when I was a child, I some of these feelings were so normal that there wasn't anything there was no red flag in my head to go, "Oh, this is anxiety," or "You're depressed," or anything
Mhm.
like that. So, I would, in my late 20s and early 30s, it had kinda gotten to the point where I would acknowledge that I would have acute episodes, there might be a situation or something where my anxiety would be triggered. I would be really worked up, rumination, couldn't let it go, was sort of debilitating. And then once the situation would resolve, it would just kind of go away.
Mhm.
So I never acknowledged it as something that was really an ongoing struggle for me. It just
Mhm.
seemed like, oh, of course, anybody would be anxious about this, um, which wasn't true. There's a lot of people who wouldn't be as
Mhm.
anxious as I was about certain things. Um, but yeah, in my early 30s, I had some really abrupt, sudden, and clear revelations about my life and myself, where, yeah, almost to what you're saying, I had an outsider's perspective on me that I had never had before. And so when this happened, we were, as we had already said, we were very involved in this big evangelical megachurch. We had 3 kids, and just everything about my life had been so not by the book, but kind of that way. There were just no red flags in my life. Nothing with like addiction or substance abuse or really any unhealthy behaviors long term or anything. So there was just nothing that was flagging me to pay attention to my internal world. And in fact, a lot of my coping mechanisms were very celebrated. So, it was like the more that I would serve or overextend myself or say yes when I really didn't want to do something, it was like
Mm.
that self-sacrifice was constantly, affirmed within Christianity. So there was just nothing that was going, you've really like pushed yourself to the edge here.
Mhm.
So anyways, when I had these revelations, it was just like it was a spiritual awakening, which teetered on a nervous breakdown. That's what I would have called it at first. This was a conventional nervous breakdown where um, it just happened very, very quickly, and I just kind of descended into this psychological darkness where it got to the point where I think what was super scary about it is I hadn't uh how do I say this? It wasn't like a slow lead up to anything, like maybe if someone like struggles with substance abuse, that might like go on for a certain amount of years and then get to a point where it's like, okay, I really need to go to rehab or something like that. There was no like slow on ramp for me. It was just like you're fine and now you're dropped into this abyss. So we had gotten to a point where I was like reaching out for help, like we need to call 911, afraid for my life kind of situation. That's just
Mhm.
how out of
Mhm.
whack my nervous system was.
Mhm.
And so in that place, as an evangelical, I had you have expectations that you don't even realize that you have until they
Mhm.
collide with reality and you realize, oh, the expectations with which I've been living my life aren't don't match reality. And so one of those was this idea that there would be a rescuer in God, some being, something named God would
Mhm.
come and rescue me. Like were I to ever be in sort of like this life and death situation. And in that moment, there was just nothing. It was a very you know, why have you forsaken me? But more than that, it was like, whatever I believe in does not exist. There's nothing coming. So it was just this feeling of being untethered out in space.
Mhm.
And so that was a very like crushing blow to my soul, but also this moment of going like, well, I better help myself then, you know? Um,
Mm.
and so we called 911 and reached out for help. And then the person that showed up to my door was a transgender person who was a part of the emergency response team. And again, as an evangelical Christian, my orientation, was to other certain groups of people and to see myself as the rescuer or the bestower of truth. It was, I have the truth. I'm the one responsible for bestowing this on you. And and there just wasn't a framework for me to receive help or truth or to trust someone that didn't fit into my nice box of correct evangelical doctrine. So, my bias that I realized in that moment was going, I, I think that you're missing something, or I can't trust you, or you don't have a correct view of God and, the
Mhm.
world or whatever because you don't agree with me. So, anyways, it was just a very vulnerable and fearful moment, but as I really like had no choice other than to just kind of tell her what was going on. And as I did and she started responding to me, it was suddenly like the essence of what I understood and what I would have called Christ was just coming off of this woman.
Mhm.
And so um suddenly it was almost like I was in this bubble where time collapsed, and just the thickest, most benevolent essence of Christ was just, we were situated in it. So it was this whole reorienting of my world and my worldview because I now had this experience of Christ where I saw the truth. I
Mhm.
saw
Mhm.
Christ in this body that I would have never
Labeled.
understood. Yes, like this was just an impossibility to me. Not that
Mhm.
I spent a lot of time thinking, what
Sure.
if Christ showed up as a transgender woman? Like I didn't really do those mental
Mhm.
exercises, but there was no category for it. So anyway, I later came to recognize that as what I would call a mystical experience. And yeah, that was like the first big veil that tore and obviously launched a whole deconstruction process, but it wasn't just a one-time event. It suddenly felt like I had um access to this other realm where I was experiencing this presence more, and not
Mhm.
just externally, but it was changes in my body, in the energy that I was feeling in my body that
Mhm.
aligned. So anyway, um
Thank
I'll
you.
stop there and let you respond.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. It's really fascinating that, you know, i- descending into hell, and you talk about this in your book, but we all have, I mean, it's a metaphor for the process, for the journey.
Mhm,
If we go long enough in this life, if not this life, maybe another one, but if we go long enough, we will descend into that pit.
mhm,
And in that pit, there's a flavor. In that pit, there's a sensation, and that's a sensation. It's the same sensation Jesus said on the cross, right? Why have you forsaken me? It's this feeling of being totally, utterly forsaken. And
mhm.
my understanding is that he was literally identifying with this this woundedness of humanity, which feels totally alone
Yeah.
and completely forsaken in that moment. But I remember distinctly, it just kind of brings up memories of that moment. I remember it was like a 2-year period for me where I lived in that, and I was suicidal. I mean, absolutely intent on dying, but
Mhm,
could not even muster the strength to do it.
mhm,
And in that, it was just like, if I had a button, if I had a switch I could flip and just erase my existence, that's what I
mhm.
wanted.
Yeah.
And I had a moment, but it's almost like in that moment when you're totally, utterly forsaken, that's when God shows up. But God
Mhm.
shows up in a way that totally obliterates any form of this dualistic kind of out there,
Yeah.
separate, and it just completely obliterates that. For me, I just remember there was a series of events, but I literally remember a moment in utter despair, wanting to die. I heard a little voice deep inside me. It sounded like my own voice, which I later
Mhm,
found out it was, but that's a whole other conversation. But not to take away that it's a divine voice, but I heard this voice and it said, if you want to die so badly, why don't you do some research on people who have died and have come back? And I thought,
mhm,
what? This violated my sense of, first of all, my evangelical
mhm,
understandings of things. It totally was a violation to that. But what I noticed was the sensation of energy because I
mhm,
was so depleted. I had no energy to live. I had no energy to even get off a couch. I
Mm-hmm.
was, if it wasn't for the, some benevolence of some good friends of mine letting me sleep on their couch, and I don't know where I would have been in life. I literally had lost everything
Mm-hmm.
in life at that point. And when I heard that voice and I sensed that energy, that spark, I said, "Where's this energy coming from?" I was almost obsessed at that. It was like someone flipped a switch, and I was like, "I got to figure this out." So I started
Mm-hmm.
doing all this research on people who died and have these near death experiences.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a spark into another dimension. And I started, and these were undeniable experiences. People that transcended religious background, socioeconomic background, didn't matter what their background was. They had almost verbatim the same experiences, not
Mm-hmm.
only in this culture, but cross culturally, and it was just fascinating. I started to realize certain tenets. And as I was listening to their stories, something was coming awake and alive in me. And I knew that this was the grace of God to me in this moment,
Yeah.
awakening
Yeah.
me.
I had similar period of obsessive, ferocious research, it is interesting. The experiences that I had, which I don't go, the book isn't about, it's not about the details of my mystical experience. But there were some things that happened, or some things that I would see that, I didn't have any context for them. So that part was scary, but it was also these very specific revelations about myself. I remember having a vision of myself like in the womb, and it was
Mm.
um almost like this rebirthing experience, but it wasn't it wasn't like a happy thing. It was it was a moment of despair kind of thing, where I felt very alone there, but I saw myself um in the womb, and I kind of immediately associated it with like, I think that this is more of the rebirth that Jesus is talking about, in the
Mm.
scriptures or whatever. But when I was struggling, I didn't have language, vision didn't quite like describe it well enough. I couldn't go around telling my friends, like, oh, I had this vision or whatever. I even had a hard time articulating it to my therapist. So it was just a lot of like online research, and the other stories I found who were describing similar things were either people who had had near death experiences, or in some cases people who had done like psychedelics or ayahuasca
Mm.
or something like that. So it was interesting to me to go like, that's I haven't done those things, but I'm experiencing the same thing, which
Mhm.
to me, that just signaled that was like, oh, this is something internally in each of us that's being
Yes.
unlocked. The external catalyst might be different. It might be, a psychedelic experience, or a near death experience, or some trauma, erupting, which is what happened for me. But it unlocks this unconscious information, so yeah, exactly like you said, I felt solace in these little moments of synchronicity
Mhm.
as I was kind of going down the rabbit trail trying to figure out what was happening.
Absolutely. It's a frequency. What's
Hmm.
interesting is that, what I distinctly felt reading about and studying folks that have had near death experiences, I started to realize there was a frequency opening up in me as I was reading about their experiences. They became my experience.
Hmm.
And it's interesting that it's like the dial on the radio is just being shifted to this new frequency. And so, although you may not have had those experiences, you can be on the frequency, because that's when we go beyond our programming,
Hmm.
our conditioning, the if we want to call it the egoic self, the false self, the flesh, however you want to put this, if we once we start to go beyond that, identify beyond that dimension, that's when we're on this frequency. And yes, we're actually realizing like, oh yeah, there's a lot going on in this frequency. There's a
Yeah.
lot of communication happening.
Yeah.
There's yeah, and it's a whole, again, it's a whole new world, a new plane of existence.
Hmm.
A
Yeah.
lot of stories we could talk about that for
Yeah.
sure.
Well, and the other interesting thing, along with that, was a lot of the biblical stories or the biblical imagery were things that were coming up for me, even that the seeing myself in the womb and associating that with rebirth. There were so many stories and symbols
Mm.
that, the experience that I had in hell or in the pit,
Mhm.
even during it, I immediately knew this is where this is what this story is
Yep.
about. The guy
Nope.
wasn't in a whale's belly.
Well, and you talk about that in your book. And I
Yes.
love what I was thinking was like, nobody taught you this. You didn't get
Right.
this from seminary. No commentary showed you this. This is coming from the root,
Hmm.
from within you. And I love that because it's
Yeah.
there. You
Yeah.
can see it in these stories.
Yes. So that was the motivation for the book was, I noticed launching off into well, at first I felt very alone, but
Mhm.
eventually found other people who were quote unquote deconstructing or on a spiritual
Mhm.
journey or whatever. And of course there was a lot of, anger about religious trauma and the
Sure.
dogma and all of that, which I was experiencing too, and I understood. However, it seemed to me that people felt like they couldn't speak their own language anymore. They couldn't use their mother tongue of
Right.
Christianity anymore,
Mm.
because they felt so triggered by all these different things. And for me, it was unlocking what my language meant, you know,
Yes.
and coming to
Yes.
see it as, um,
Mhm.
it, you know, if I say, I love you, those are just words. Hopefully, they're, depending on the presence and the energy with which I use them, they're an opening or a portal to, a heart connection with someone that I'm saying that to. But if I say, I love you, and then someone comes along in Spanish and says, like, te amo, we're saying the same thing, and
Mhm.
it would be
Mhm.
ridiculous of me to say,
Mhm.
like, well, no, I love you is the only way to say it.
Right. Right. 100%.
Yeah. Or if you were hurt or abused by someone who was saying, I love you, suddenly going like, well, I can never say I love you again. I can only say te amo, I can only speak Spanish. We're not using English anymore. It
Mhm.
almost felt like that. And so I think in writing the book, it was really going, I want to help people see how
Mm.
these stories should be read symbolically as maps to take you deeper into your inner world, and
Mm.
they're representations of processes and the spiritual journey and that kind of thing. And once I
Well,
saw it that way, it basically just not eliminated all. I just wasn't triggered by anything in the Bible anymore.
I love it. I absolutely love what you're saying here because yeah, biblical language on the surface is it can be very abusive or judge.
Yes.
I mean, this is why when people read the stories, you read the Old Testament stories and you think God is like a monster in these stories. And then you read
Hmm.
about Jesus and you're going, I don't understand. How is Jesus so different? His life so
Hmm.
different, teaching so different than what even he said it like, oh, you've heard it said, Moses said this.
Hmm.
I say to you something completely different.
Hmm.
And the mental gymnastics and the cognitive dissonance that theologians go through to try to reconcile those statements, it just doesn't work. But what's interesting about this is, if I look, and I love that you talk about this in your book, that Jesus is the frequency, right? So
Hmm.
Jesus is a certain, I like to think of it in terms of frequency because, sound, right? We even call him the word of God. What is a word? It's a sound, it's a frequency.
Hmm.
There's a certain frequency to him, to his life that is fundamentally different than
Yes.
the language of the Bible. And I know that sounds crazy because we're obviously reading about Jesus in this thing that was put together in the 4th century called the Bible. And I get it, but the frequency is distinctly different. And you make a statement. So once we understand that frequency is, oh, Jesus is the frequency of the divine,
Hmm.
not the language that we typically have been hearing, it does give you the language back. Because then you realize like, oh, this is not a different language. This is actually I'm just hearing the heart or the source of the language. But you
Hmm.
talk about I think you have a chapter in your book that talks about the God character not being obvious. Like,
Mhm.
so then you're going back to these stories, maybe Old Testament stories about God, and the character who plays God is not God in
Mhm.
the stories. There's
Mhm.
actually a different character there, and you go, oh, that's the frequency of Jesus, but it's not often,
Yes.
oftentimes not God. Can you say more about that?
Yeah. Oh, I love how you're setting that up. Yeah. I think that the chapter you're referring to is chapter 2. It's called Finding Christ in the Bible. And it basically, the premise of it is what you're saying is that you cannot understand what the stories are saying, what the language is communicating until you have personally experienced the frequency of Christ. You can call it Jesus, and how I kind of parse that out is like the frequency of Christ was what was animating and embodying the
Mm,
33-year-old man. So we have Jesus, in a historical context, and we have, Christ, which is the word, which is the frequency that has been permeating everything since the beginning of time. But there is no time, it's just the eternal now and the frequency of that. So that's what's animating this person named Jesus. So it's not until you have a personal experience with that frequency that you can then understand what any of this is about. And so, yeah, I go back into some of the Old Testament stories. One of the examples was the story of Abraham and Isaac, where, it's you have the God character and you have Abraham and you have Isaac, and God has told Abraham, you have to go murder your son to prove your love to me, is essentially the story is set up. And it's interesting because I'm not even sure that this is completely avoidable, even if you don't grow up in a religious context. But that was essentially my framework for God was you have to do, XYZ uncomfortable thing to prove your love for me, and how
mm,
far are you going to go in obedience? And that was really the source of my anxieties was, how far am I going to push this? you know, doing
mhm,
something that I don't really want to do. I can look back and go like that wasn't anything I wanted to do. I wasn't aligned with that task I was trying to carry out at all, and that's where the anxiety was coming from. But
100%.
yeah, but it is this idea of like I have to do the right thing, and
Mm,
whatever's in us that is quote unquote commanding that
mhm,
is represented by this God character. So in the story, um, you have the God character saying that, and then Abraham, travels on his journey, and you have Isaac, who's basically in submission to all of this, a dead man walking for 3 days. So you're like, who does that
interesting.
remind me of? Yeah. And then before he goes up the hill, Abraham says to his servants, y'all wait right here. I'm going to take my son up the hill. Y'all watch the donkeys and then we'll be back. Like before he even goes up to sacrifice his son, he's saying we're going to come back. Like this isn't what you think is going to happen is not going to happen. But he has to carry out the whole ritual. We have to see the whole ritual in the story before we snap awake and realize, oh, it was never, God wasn't asking this. So, my suggestion in the story is that Isaac, the one who, you know, uh, up until the climax, like, is expecting to be killed, going to be killed, about to have this extreme violence done to him at the hands of his father, and he's acting non-violently. He's not retaliating or anything like that in the story. And so, yeah, my suggestion was the God character wasn't God, but you can't see that until you're absolutely certain of, as you said, the frequency of what Christ is like. Then you see Christ in Isaac, and that's the more proper representation of Christ or that frequency.
Mhm,
So but then you kind of understand the function of what the story is trying to do.
Mm,
know, where
mhm,
it felt like this parallel in my life where you build up this idea of God, whatever that is for you, even
mhm, mhm,
in secular society for people who don't believe in God, it might be some other ideology, like
mm.
an ideology that you have to subscribe to. And there's, you might not say it like this, but there's good guys and bad guys, or there's oppressors and victims. And, these are the rules that we have to play by. And anyway, so you have, everyone has their quote unquote God,
Mhm, mhm.
and, anyway, and then this shocking revelation of what God is not ends up being this grace.
Totally, absolutely. And this kind of gets into, and I love that you talk about this in the book, that you really unpack, you do a great job of unpacking the concept of myth and not,
Mhm,
and I think again, people, when they hear the word myth, it's a trigger word, right? It's like, oh, you're saying it's not true. And it's like, no, no, the whole, actually, I'm convinced that this entire universe is a myth. This
mhm,
entire cosmos is a myth. What do I mean by that? It's a metaphor. The whole thing's a metaphor for a deeper reality.
mhm,
And if nothing, and we're learning this through quantum mechanics now, and the more we start to understand the nature of reality, we realize nothing is as it appears. Like
mhm,
the atomic structures that we see in 3D space and time, they're not actually that way
mhm,
at the root. And so when we understand that, we go, this is not a literal, this is a metaphor. And there's something in the East, in Eastern traditions, they teach, as is the atom, so is the universe, as is the micro, so is the macro. It's all
yes,
following metaphoric patterns here.
yes,
If we can understand that, then we can look back at these stories that are contained in the Bible, and we're taught to read them, to look at things very literally, which is, part of the problem with it's like seeing the Matrix as the real world, right?
mhm,
To use that analogy, it's a
mhm,
Matrix. It's not the real world. It's the whole point. So
mhm,
when we understand that this story is not literal, it's not literal, but it's also not literal.
mhm,
It's it's a myth. And the concept of the word myth, which you share in your book, is there's a deeper transcendent reality that's being communicated here. And if we can have eyes for that in the story and not get caught up on the mechanics, which so many folks who reject the stories, because if you talk to somebody who may be an atheist or somebody, and they'll say, well, this is just fairy tales, right? These are not real. There's nothing of value in these stories, because clearly God didn't create the universe in 6 24-hour periods, or
mhm,
uh clearly Jonah wasn't swallowed by a whale and
mhm.
survived. Like, we're missing the point of the metaphor,
Yeah.
of the myth, right?
Yes.
Which is the transcendent reality. Can you say
Yes.
more about that?
Yeah. Well, I love that you pointed out the thing about the atom. If you understand the atom, you understand about the microcosm and the macrocosm. So there's a chapter in there where I kind of talk about that with Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man, where he basically is positing that if you can understand yourself, the more deeply you understand yourself, the more deeply you understand the entire universe. That basically all the patterns and the laws that are at work within us are the same laws that are at work within the universe.
Hmm.
So in the book, I kind of use this metaphor of a seed as the vehicle for getting into myth. And what I do is kind of take a seed and say, when you think about a seed or an acorn or something, you picture the little seed that you can hold in your fingers. Um, but that's really all that is the outer shell that is encapsulating the germinating potential which is inside. So,
Hmm.
how a seed actually grows is there's an embryo that grows off of the tree. And in order for that embryo to fulfill its destiny, which is to become a tree on its
Hmm.
own, its destiny is not to stay attached to the tree that it grew from, it's to fall off and take its own little journey and then become its own tree. And so to take that journey, it has to have this protective shell form over it and fall from the tree. So I make this parallel. My thesis is that this is on some layer, this is what the story of the Garden of Eden and the fall and all of this is talking about, is our in infancy, we come into the world in this unitive consciousness, which is represented, as the embryo growing from the tree. We're one with the source. When the embryo grows on the tree, it's not separate from it. It's a part of it. It's an extension of it. So, whatever language you want to use for that, like I'm an extension of source or an extension of God. It's literally like the
Image
God.
and likeness. Yep.
Yes. The life, the frequency of God is what is animating my very life. And so as infants, we're only aware of that. There's no awareness that we're separate from anything. Infants literally think that they're one with their mother.
Yeah. Yep.
So
interesting that the
anyway,
first psychological crisis is around 2.
yes.
When we call the terrible twos. What makes it so terrible? Well, I have an identity that's now forming that's separate.
Yes. And so this is the beginning of the shell forming, which I call the false self, which is a protective shell, or we could call it the ego, the egoic personality or whatnot. And to your point, it's not something to be demonized. It's a vehicle that is absolutely essential to carry us on our journey of life. Like we have to get from point A to point B, and that is the function of this shell. So it's our coping mechanisms, it's the masks that we have to wear, to protect us. So that's what carries us. And there's a little bit of redemption that happens, in terms of original sin. It's like, no, I wasn't originally a piece of crap, it's just this state of consciousness where we've lost awareness of what's inside the shell. We come to identify exclusively with the outer shell. And there's this spiritual amnesia, so to speak, where in the story, God puts Adam to sleep. It never says that Adam wakes up. So it's essentially he goes to sleep in the matrix, like you said, and then he associates life with this dreamlike state of being in it, thinking the dream is the real thing. So we lose contact with our true self or our essence. And then all these stories are really about, first of all, in a lot of Jesus's parables where he's talking about, the treasure in the field. And I kind of make a joke. I'm like, I've never gone past a field and thought to myself, I'm sure there's treasure in that field. You have no awareness that anything is buried in the field until somebody tells you, until someone comes along and says, there's treasure buried out in that field. That might be all the information that you get, but that's enough. If you were certain about that, that might be enough for you to start digging. So I think that the initial stage of waking up is becoming aware of what we're saying. The treasure that Jesus is referring to is that true self, or our authentic essence, our germinating potential, our life force, which was one with God in the beginning and still is, because God is part of this whole process. So there's no separation from nature or God or the universe. It's just our perception, depending on where we are in the journey. So the true false self, the metaphor of the seed is the vehicle I kind of use, and then I reanalyze all these stories as essentially trying to point out ad nauseum that this is what the stories are saying.
Yes. And you do a great job in the book, or even the title, right? A Return to Eden is really interesting because this is the scene of the quote unquote problem, right? Of, Adam's original state was masculine and feminine in one being.
Yes, this androgynous being.
Totally. And Eve was taken out. It's interesting that you posit in the book, and I don't know that I've ever heard somebody do this, but it's fascinating to me that it says Adam was removed from the garden, right? But there's no indication that Eve was ever removed from the garden, which is really, there's so many, we could go down that rabbit hole for a long time, but that's really interesting that the goal is always union, right? The goal is to come back to Eden, right? To come back to this garden, because what's going on in the garden? Well, Well, that's the place of the unitive state, right? Where the
Mhm.
masculine and feminine come together. I've always, and I was back when I used to be on the Heretic Happy Hour in the early days when I'd go round and round, we would talk about this, especially in the terms of Mary Magdalene. I got this thing of like, oh, he's the Mary Magdalene freak. But my thing is, I've always known that there is more going on, the symbolism, even in the
Mhm.
synoptic gospels, which are, to me, that's a whole other conversation, whitewashed. But the synoptic gospels that we have in current form, even still, you can't hide the symbolism that is there.
Mhm.
But here's interesting that here's this man who comes alive in a garden with a woman
Mhm.
together. And it's like, oh, it's like this, the imagery of the garden where the two became separate and there was enmity between the masculine and the feminine essence. And now suddenly they come together in a garden in the resurrection. And then she becomes she becomes the proclamation of this new reality to the other disciples. That gets lost in all of this. And
Yes.
it's not an accident. It's not some just random part of it's if we understand the power of myth and the power of the story and what we're indicating here. And I read a book one time. It was called one of the best books I've ever read, written by a Hindu. It was called The Yoga of Jesus, and it
Mhm.
was explaining the teachings of Jesus through the lens of yoga, which yoga means union, inner union, masculine, feminine, Ida, Pingala, the idea of the masculine and feminine coming together in one being. That is the state of yoga, which is union. So even when Jesus says, if you're tired, heavy laden, learn from me because my
Mhm.
yoke or yoga union is
Mhm.
easy. My
Mhm.
burden is light. And this is the aim here. What is the goal
Mhm.
for to come back to Eden, for the
Mhm.
masculine and feminine to come together to achieve this unitive state, because that's where we are truly the imago Dei, or the image and likeness of God, from that state of inner union.
Yep.
And I just don't know that I hear people talking about this
Yeah.
the way you're talking about it in the book Return to Eden. So that's why I think that even the title is spot on.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Well, and it's interesting because I knew that people were going to be coming from all different contexts reading this book. Some people were going to read it with no point of reference to yoga or any Eastern philosophies or
Sure.
anything like that. So I was real careful to keep it in strictly Christian language
Yep.
because I
Totally.
wanted to reveal it all. That this was what the language was saying. But to your point, yoga was a huge teacher for me, and I'm actually working on something with choir, an upcoming like collaborative book where I'm talking a little bit about yoga and kundalini
Mhm.
um and kind of describing, and this is credit to Joseph Campbell who I reference in the book, but he has this amazing teaching on the virgin birth. And when I first heard this, it was like it's like this music to my ears where I was literally like walking around asking people like, "Have you ever heard of this guy?" Like,
Mm,
why are we not talking about this? And it's just so interesting to see the things that are hidden in plain sight and have always been there, but you just can't see it until you can see it.
totally.
But he essentially uses the Hindu chakra system
Mhm.
and describes how, at the very base of the spine is the Kundalini energy, which is represented by the snake. And
Mhm.
there's each chakra going up the spine. The lowest one, there's a symbol of the lingam and yoni, which in Hinduism is, symbolizes the masculine and feminine and the intercourse between the two. And so in the lower pelvic basin of the spine, you have three different energy centers, which are, you know, kind of preoccupied with eating and reproduction, and then competition, where you're trying to smash the other. And that's a representation of the flesh or the false self or the ego. And so the depiction in the chakras is when the Kundalini energy wakes up and moves up the spine and finally moves into the heart, there's we see the lingam and yoni again, but this time it's in gold. And so you see the consummation of masculine and feminine, but it's at the center of the heart.
Mhm.
And so as energy comes up, this is like the birth of compassion and into the true spiritual life and
Mhm.
proper humanity where,
Mhm.
it's this co-suffering love. But that's the symbol of that's what the virgin birth is. So I was getting this whole new imagery of it, and even like the science of it in yoga, but it was being described to me through
Mhm.
the
Christian.
the
Yeah.
Hindu chakra system, in
Oh,
yoga.
totally. Mhm.
And so anyways, it just totally blew my mind. And then he points out how even Buddha, and you can go look this up,
Mhm.
look up like Buddha birthed out of his mother's side. It's the symbol
Mhm.
of him being birthed out right here at the center of the heart. So anyway, when it's not your native tongue and you're not
Right.
totally immersed and indoctrinated in it, like I can look at that picture of Buddha coming out of his mother's side
Mhm.
and know that that's a metaphor. Clearly that didn't literally happen. I know it's metaphor. I know it's myth, but
Mhm.
for us, it's total heresy to say that the
Right.
virgin birth wasn't, a physical anomaly.
Right.
It's a
Well,
it's a symbolic picture. It's a myth.
totally, totally of divine and human origins, and the ascending
Yes.
and descending. I mean, Ida and Pingala, or the masculine and feminine essence, is an ascending and descending energy that meet in the middle at the heart
Yes.
level. And this is where the expression comes from. But even the language of, like, if you understand, like, you can use any language, right? We can use biblical language.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what do we think Jacob's ladder is? I mean, it's not Kundalini energy, us angels ascending and descending,
Mm-hmm.
right? On this
Mm-hmm.
ladder, right? Of the
Mm-hmm.
spine, kind of up, totally. It's all there if we
Yeah.
understand it.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. And Jung would, Carl Jung, who I reference in the book, he would call it
sure,
like the bridge between the conscious and the unconscious world.
sure,
So,
totally.
yeah. And
Moses,
it's,
the staff of Moses with the snake, looking at,
mm-hmm.
moving, obviously the symbol of the medical field. But it's
Yeah.
also it's a yogic symbol from the East, thousands of years before the time of Jesus, even
Yes.
predating Judeo history. So we're speaking the same language. It's like, oh, who made it Western and Eastern, right?
Mm-hmm.
As if these are two separate. This is fiction, right?
Yeah.
There's one language.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and when we're in that dualistic mind, it's
Mhm.
it's almost as if to say, you know, before I had my experiences or whatever, it was if anything about what Buddha said was true, it felt like it diminished something about
Right,
Jesus.
right, right.
Like if there was any other culture that had stories of virgin births or something, like that couldn't be real because that diminishes the specialness of
Mm,
Jesus's birth or whatever. And now it's just this beautiful opening where it's like, no, this is so real. This
mm.
is the most real thing. It's so real that it is continually and forever bubbling up in every language, every culture, every
Yes.
religion. So myth really takes us to the farthest edge that we can go
Mm,
before this union with the divine or with what's
sure.
most real. It's a portal into that.
Absolutely. So well said. Yeah, that's totally the case. Yeah. And I love it. And it's coming through many different languages. So if the moment you think you coined it in this cultural context, you'll
Hmm.
see it in a wholly different culture. But it's like, oh, it's exactly what you said. It's not because it's not true. It's because it is true. And it's so true that it seeps through so many different um metaphors or myths to
Hmm.
contain, but it's the same message
Yeah. Yeah.
of, even, the Hindu creation story, Shiva and Shakti, masculine, feminine, coming
Hmm.
together to form creation, to make creation happen. It's like, this is a metaphor for our life, right? This
Yeah.
is the human journey, masculine and feminine coming together to create. It's the
Yes.
Jesus Mary Magdalene story. It's all there.
Yes.
So we can tell it in whatever tradition we want. Christian tradition, great.
Yeah.
Non-traditional tradition, great. That's
Yeah.
that's the key there. But I totally recommend people. I know we're out of time. I feel like we could talk about this for a long time. I appreciate your book. I appreciate you. I know none of these things that you're writing about come easily, because they come from going to the depths, right? To descending into those places. So to come out. But I would say, just what the teaching of Jesus that comes to mind when I'm listening to your book and hearing the things you're talking about is when Jesus said to Nicodemus, like, look, I'm talking about like unless you're born from above, from this place, you can't understand any of this. If you don't understand earthly things, how are you going to understand heavenly things? And I know that sounds like very mystical language, just because it is, right? It comes from experience, and this understanding must come from experience, and that's why I think there is a process. That's why I'm excited about the inner journey, and why I do the work that I do, is because nobody can teach you this, but you can experience it. But things can lead you into a process, and I think your book can be a great tool for people that will lead them into a process that will lead to experience. So thank you for writing it. Where can people hear more about you and your work and get a hold of your book?
Yeah. Well, I've got my little poster and everything, but again, here's the book, Returning to Eden by Heather Hamilton. It's on Amazon or wherever you buy your books. People can check out my website, which is just returningtoeden.com. That has a link to sign up for my newsletter. It's just a monthly newsletter called Unorthodox. I give a little offering, just what I'm thinking about each month, and then updates about podcasts. And I'm sure I'll include this in a newsletter. And then on social media, on Instagram, it's Heather Hamilton 1, and Facebook, you can search Heather Hamilton author.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And guys, as always interested in your comments, and I'd love to hear your thoughts, and all thoughts are welcome. So thank you, Heather, for being on the show, and thanks for the book. And guys, go get a copy of this book. I think you'll love it. All right.
Thanks,
Until
Jamal.
next time.
All right. Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.